Nobody noticed the quiet woman in seat 27B. She looked like any other passenger heading home. But when both engines exploded at 41,000 feet and the pilots lost control, her military call sign, Reaper, would make F-22 fighter pilots stand at attention in tribute to the hero who saved 190 lives. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The woman in seat 27B looked unremarkable. Gray cardigan, faded jeans, wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose as she read a paperback thriller. Her silver-streaked brown hair was pulled into a messy bun, and her only luggage was a worn backpack stuffed under the seat in front of her. Nobody on American Airlines Flight 1847 from Seattle to Miami gave Sarah, Reaper, Mackenzie a second glance. Not the businessman in first class reviewing his presentation. Not the young couple returning from their honeymoon. Not even the flight attendants who had been trained to spot unusual passengers. That was exactly how Colonel Sarah Mackenzie preferred it. At 52 years old, Sarah had spent 30 years in the United States Air Force, 25 of them flying the most advanced fighter jets ever created. Her service record was so classified that even most Pentagon officials didn't have clearance to read it. She had flown 287 combat missions across 4 continents, earned the Air Force Cross, 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and commendations from 6 allied nations. Her call sign, Reaper, had been earned during a night mission over hostile territory when she single-handedly neutralized an entire enemy air defense network, clearing the way for a special operations rescue that saved 14 Americans. The enemy never saw her coming. They never even knew what hit them until it was over. But today was March 15, 2024, and Sarah was just another passenger on a routine commercial flight, heading to Miami for her niece's college graduation. She had retired from active duty 8 months ago and was still adjusting to the strange quietness of civilian life. As Flight 1847 pushed back from Gate C-12 at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Sarah automatically noted the time, 2:47 p.m. Pacific. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner carried 178 passengers and a crew of 190 souls total. The weather was clear, temperature 62 degrees, with light winds from the northwest. Old habits died hard. Captain James Reynolds and First Officer Lisa Chen completed their pre-flight checks in the cockpit. Both were experienced aviators with spotless records. Reynolds had logged over 15,000 flight hours in his 23-year career with American Airlines. Chen, though younger, had accumulated 8,200 hours and was considered one of the airline's finest pilots. Neither had any idea that one of their passengers had more flight hours in advanced military aircraft than both of them combined. The first 3 hours of the flight were peaceful. Sarah dozed intermittently, her book forgotten in her lap. Around her, passengers watched movies, worked on laptops, or slept. The flight attendants served drinks and snacks. Everything was routine. Then, at 5:43 p.m. Central Time, as Flight 1847 cruised at 41,000 feet over Louisiana, everything changed. The first indication was subtle, a slight shudder that most passengers didn't even notice. Sarah's eyes snapped open immediately. Her body had been trained by 3 decades of combat flying to recognize when something wasn't right. The shudder came again, stronger this time. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds frowned at his instruments. "You seeing this?" he asked Chen. "Engine 2 is showing fluctuating pressure readings," Chen replied, her voice calm but concerned. "And I'm getting an intermittent warning light." "Let's run the checklist," Reynolds said, his hands already moving across the controls. In the cabin, passengers were beginning to notice the irregular vibrations. Conversations quieted. People looked around nervously. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, drawing a sharp look from a nearby flight attendant. "Ma'am, please remain seated." "What's your name?" Sarah interrupted, her voice calm but commanding. "Jessica." "Ma'am, I need you to sit down." "Jessica, I'm a pilot." "Something's wrong with engine 2, possibly 3. I can hear it." You need to check with the cockpit. Jessica hesitated. She had been trained to handle difficult passengers, but something in this woman's demeanor made her pause. There was an authority there, a competence that couldn't be faked. Please wait here, Jessica said, and hurried toward the front of the aircraft. 60 seconds later, the situation deteriorated catastrophically. Engine 2 exploded. The massive turbine disintegrated in a shower of metal fragments that tore through the engine cowling and damaged critical hydraulic lines and electrical systems. The aircraft lurched violently to the right as Reynolds fought the controls. Then Engine 3 began failing. Later investigations would reveal that a microscopic manufacturing defect in a single turbine blade had caused the initial failure. But that defect, combined with extreme bad luck, had triggered a cascade of damage that shouldn't have been possible. Shrapnel from Engine 2 had severed redundant systems, corrupted flight computers, and damaged the aircraft's hydraulic systems in multiple locations simultaneously. Warning alarms filled the cockpit. Reynolds and Chen stared at instrument panels lighting up with red alerts. Jesus Christ, Reynolds breathed. We're losing hydraulics in all three systems. Flight controls are barely responding. Engine 3 is failing, Chen reported, her voice tight. Oil pressure dropping, temperature rising. We need to shut it down before it tears itself apart. If we shut down 3, we're flying on one engine with compromised flight controls, Reynolds said. We'll never make it to an airport. Sarah was already moving toward the cockpit. Jessica tried to stop her, but Sarah gently moved her aside. I need you to trust me, Sarah said. I can help. She knocked firmly on the cockpit door. Captain, my name is Colonel Sarah Mackenzie, U.S. Air Force retired. I'm a pilot with extensive emergency training. You need my help right now. Reynolds, dealing with multiple cascading failures, made a split-second decision that would save 190 lives. Let her in. Sarah entered the cockpit and immediately assessed the situation with the practiced eye of someone who had handled emergencies in combat conditions where enemy fire and system failures happened simultaneously. What do we have? She asked, her voice calm and professional. Catastrophic failure of Engine 2, damage to all three hydraulic systems, Engine 3 is failing, flight computers are corrupted, and we're losing control authority, Reynolds said rapidly. We're 70 miles from New Orleans, but I don't think we can make it. Sarah's mind was already working through solutions, applying 30 years of training to a situation that exceeded normal civilian aviation procedures. Captain Reynolds, First Officer Chen, listen carefully, Sarah said. I'm going to walk you through procedures that aren't in your commercial training. They're from military emergency protocols for battle-damaged aircraft. If we execute them precisely, we can save this aircraft. Who the hell are you? Reynolds asked, even as he struggled with unresponsive controls. Right now, I'm the person who's going to keep 190 people alive, Sarah replied. First Officer Chen, shut down Engine 3 immediately before it causes more damage. Captain Reynolds, I need you to ignore what your training says about losing a second engine and trust me. Something in her voice, the absolute confidence, the professional competence, made Reynolds nod. Chen, shut it down. As Engine 3 spooled down, Sarah moved between the two pilots, her hands hovering near the controls without touching them, her eyes scanning instruments with practiced precision. Okay, here's what we're doing, Sarah said. We're going to use differential power management on Engine 1 combined with manual flight control techniques that compensate for hydraulic losses. Captain, you're going to fly with techniques designed for battle-damaged fighters. It's going to feel wrong, but it works. How could that possibly work on a commercial aircraft? Chen asked. Because physics is physics, Sarah replied. The principles are the same. First Officer, I need you to manually manage our electrical systems. We're going to shut down non-essential systems and reroute power to flight-critical functions. What followed was 43 minutes of the most intense flying Reynolds and Chen had ever experienced. Sarah coached them through emergency procedures that no commercial pilot had ever attempted, applying combat aviation techniques to a civilian aircraft emergency. She had Reynolds flying the crippled 787 using control inputs that seemed counterintuitive but compensated for their hydraulic losses. She had Chen manually managing systems that were normally automated, keeping critical functions online through careful power management. "We're going to attempt a landing at Louis Armstrong New Orleans International," Sarah said. "But it's going to be unlike any landing you've ever done. We'll come in faster than normal, with limited flap deployment, and we're going to use engine power for pitch control because our hydraulics can't handle traditional inputs." "That's insane," Reynolds said, even as he followed her instructions. "No, that's how you land a combat-damaged aircraft when conventional procedures won't work," Sarah replied. "I've done this before. Trust me." In the cabin, flight attendants were preparing passengers for an emergency landing. People were crying, praying, holding hands with strangers. They could feel the aircraft struggling, hear the unusual sound of flying on a single engine, sense that something was terribly wrong. Sarah coordinated with New Orleans Air Traffic Control, explaining their situation and requirements in precise technical language that left controllers certain they were dealing with someone who knew exactly what she was doing. New Orleans Tower, American 1847 Heavy. "We have catastrophic damage to 2 engines, compromised hydraulics, and limited flight control authority. We require emergency equipment, longest available runway, and clearance for non-standard approach profile. Be advised, we have a highly experienced military pilot coordinating our emergency procedures." The tower controller's voice came back instantly. "American 1847, you're cleared for runway 11, 10,000 feet. All emergency equipment is rolling. The field is yours." As they began their approach, Sarah talked Reynolds and Chen through every step. Her voice never wavered, never showed doubt. She had seen worse situations in combat, had brought damaged fighters home when conventional wisdom said they should have been unflyable. "Airspeed 180 knots, maintaining current descent rate," Sarah directed. "Captain, slight power increase, there. Hold that. First officer, prepare for manual gear extension. We're not trusting the damaged hydraulics for this." The landing gear extended with a reassuring thunk. 2 miles from threshold, Sarah continued. "Airspeed 175 knots. This is going to be a firm touchdown, but that's what we want. We need to get this aircraft on the ground and stopped." Reynolds' hands were steady on the controls, following Sarah's instructions with complete trust. Chen managed systems with precision, her training meshing perfectly with Sarah's guidance. 1 mile. Airspeed 170 knots. Hold your approach angle. Don't try to flare like a normal landing, we're going to drive it onto the runway. The wounded 787 crossed the threshold of runway 11. Emergency vehicles raced alongside, lights flashing. 50 feet. 40. 30. Hold it steady. 20. 10. The aircraft hit the runway hard, exactly as Sarah had planned. The landing gear absorbed the impact. Reynolds immediately deployed thrust reversers on the single working engine while manually applying maximum braking. The Boeing 787 rolled down the runway, slowing, and stopped with 2,400 feet of runway still remaining. For 3 seconds, there was absolute silence in the cockpit. Then Reynolds let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 40 minutes. "Holy Mother of God. Nicely done, Captain," Sarah said quietly. "First Officer Chen, excellent systems management. You both performed flawlessly." Emergency crews surrounded the aircraft. The evacuation was orderly and calm. Every single passenger and crew member walked away without injuries. As passengers gathered in the terminal, many were crying, hugging loved ones they'd called from their phones during the emergency. News crews were already arriving, having monitored the emergency radio traffic. That's when Jessica, the flight attendant, told reporters about the mysterious woman who had helped save the flight. There was a passenger, a woman in her 50s, who went into the cockpit and helped the pilots land the plane. She said she was a retired Air Force pilot. The story spread quickly through social and military channels. By the time Sarah was giving her statement to NTSB investigators, word had reached active-duty Air Force personnel in the region. Major David Hammer Morrison and Captain Jennifer Phoenix Taylor were flying F-22 Raptors on a training exercise out of Barksdale Air Force Base, just 300 miles away. When they heard through military communications that Colonel Reaper Mackenzie had been aboard the emergency flight and had coordinated the rescue, their reaction was immediate. Control, Hammer and Phoenix requesting permission for ceremonial flyby of Louis Armstrong International, Morrison radioed. We have confirmation that Colonel Reaper Mackenzie coordinated successful emergency response. Request authorization to render appropriate honors. The response was instant. Hammer and Phoenix, you are authorized. Colonel Mackenzie's service record warrants full military honors. Execute at your discretion. Sarah was standing outside the terminal, declining interview requests from news crews, when she heard the distinctive sound. Her head snapped up. 2 F-22 Raptors appeared from the north, flying in perfect formation. As they passed over the airport at exactly 500 feet, both pilots were clearly visible in their cockpits, standing at attention despite being strapped into their seats, rendering the ultimate military salute to a legendary pilot. The Raptors executed a precision aileron roll, a maneuver that required incredible skill, and came around for a second pass. This time, Morrison's voice came over the airport's emergency frequency, broadcast for everyone to hear. Colonel Sarah Reaper Mackenzie, this is Major Morrison and Captain Taylor, 525th Fighter Squadron. On behalf of the United States Air Force and all the pilots who have learned from your example, thank you for your service and for saving 190 lives today. Your legacy inspires us every time we fly. Reaper, you are a legend. Sir. The F-22s performed a final vertical climb, afterburners blazing, and disappeared into the sky. Sarah stood perfectly still, tears running down her face as passengers and airline personnel around her erupted in applause. Captain Reynolds approached her, his own eyes wet. Colonel Mackenzie. I don't know how to thank you. Everything you did in that cockpit. I've never seen anything like it. You saved all of us. Sarah wiped her eyes and smiled. Captain, you and First Officer Chen executed perfectly under impossible conditions. You saved this aircraft. I just provided some additional technical guidance. The hell you did, Reynolds said firmly. You walked us through procedures I didn't even know existed. You kept us calm when we should have been panicking. You landed that aircraft when I'm not sure anyone else could have. Over the following days, the story of American Airlines Flight 1847 became international news. Sarah gave a single interview where she deflected credit to the cockpit crew and praised Reynolds and Chen's professionalism. But it was the image that went viral, a photograph of the two F-22 Raptors performing their flyby, with the caption explaining that the pilots were saluting a retired Air Force colonel who had saved 190 lives using combat aviation techniques. Military aviation forums exploded with discussions of Colonel Reaper Mackenzie's legendary career. Stories emerged from pilots she had trained, missions she had flown, and the impact she had made on an entire generation of military aviators. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation revealed that the engine failure and subsequent damage had created conditions that exceeded standard commercial aviation training. Their report specifically noted that the successful outcome was directly attributable to Sarah's application of military emergency procedures not covered in civilian pilot curricula. Her actions led to recommendations that certain combat aviation techniques be incorporated into commercial pilot emergency training programs. 3 weeks later, Sarah received a call from the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Colonel Mackenzie, I'm calling to personally thank you for your actions and to inform you that you've been awarded the Airman's Medal for heroism involving voluntary risk of life under non-combat conditions. Your application of military aviation expertise to save civilian lives exemplifies the very best of Air Force values. Sarah stood in her small apartment, looking at the photographs on her wall, images from her 30-year career, planes she had flown, missions she had completed, pilots she had trained. "Sir, I was just doing what any pilot would do when people needed help," she replied. "No, Colonel. You did what only the very best pilots could do. That's why they call you Reaper." 6 months later, Sarah stood before an auditorium filled with military and civilian pilots at the annual International Aviation Safety Symposium. She had been asked to present on the application of military emergency procedures to civilian aviation. As she concluded her presentation, she looked out at the audience, young pilots, experienced captains, military aviators, and aviation students, all hanging on her every word. "The lesson from Flight 1847 isn't about specific techniques or procedures," Sarah said. "It's about maintaining proficiency, staying calm under pressure, and understanding that our training is never truly complete. Every flight, whether military or civilian, whether combat or commercial, requires the same dedication to excellence and the same commitment to bringing everyone home safely." She paused, remembering that day over New Orleans. The weight of 190 lives in her hands. "We don't fly alone. We fly with the knowledge of everyone who trained us, the experience of every emergency we've handled, and the trust of everyone who depends on us." When Captain Reynolds opened that cockpit door, he demonstrated the kind of decision-making that saves lives, the willingness to accept help from unexpected sources when conventional approaches aren't enough. The audience rose in a standing ovation. As Sarah left the stage, a young Air Force lieutenant approached her nervously. "Colonel Mackenzie, I'm Lieutenant Sarah Chen, no relation to First Officer Chen, but interesting coincidence. I just wanted to say that you're the reason I became a pilot. I read about your career and realized that aviation could be about more than just flying, it could be about service and excellence and making a difference." Sarah smiled and shook the young woman's hand. "What's your call sign, Lieutenant?" "They call me Ghost, ma'am. Because I'm good at appearing when needed and getting the job done quietly." "That's a fine call sign," Sarah said warmly. "And it comes with responsibility. Wear it with pride and live up to what it represents." As the lieutenant walked away, Sarah reflected on her journey. She had spent 30 years in military aviation, had retired thinking her flying days were behind her, and then found herself in a situation where every skill she had ever learned was needed to save lives. The woman in seat 27B had seemed unremarkable. Gray cardigan, messy bun, worn backpack. Nobody had given her a second glance. But when catastrophic emergency struck Flight 1847, when 190 lives hung in the balance, when conventional aviation procedures weren't enough, Colonel Sarah Reaper Mackenzie had stepped forward and demonstrated why legends earn their call signs. The F-22 pilot standing at attention in tribute hadn't been honoring just a successful emergency response. They had been honoring 30 years of excellence, dedication, and service. They had been acknowledging someone whose career represented the absolute pinnacle of military aviation. They had been saluting a pilot who proved that heroes don't retire, they just wait for the moment when their extraordinary abilities are needed most. Sarah Mackenzie had been unremarkable in seat 27B because she chose to be. But when duty called, when lives needed saving, when the impossible needed to become routine, she had been exactly what she had always been. Reaper. Legendary. Unbeatable. And 190 people were alive because of it. 2 months after the incident, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her home in Colorado Springs. Captain James Reynolds stood on her doorstep, holding a carefully wrapped package. "Colonel Mackenzie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I hope you don't mind me showing up unannounced. I needed to deliver this personally." Sarah invited him in, and Reynolds placed the package on her coffee table. "This is from every passenger and crew member on Flight 1847. We all contributed." Inside was a custom-made flight jacket, deep blue leather with gold embroidery. On the back was an image of a Boeing 787 with one engine, surrounded by the words, "American 1847, March 15, 2024, 190 souls saved." On the front, above the heart, was embroidered simply, Reaper. "There's more," Reynolds said, pulling out a thick leather-bound book. "Every single person on that flight wrote you a letter. Passengers, flight attendants, First Officer Chen, the gate agents, even the ground crew in New Orleans. We all wanted you to know what your actions meant to us." Sarah opened the book with trembling hands. The first letter was from a young mother. "Dear Colonel Mackenzie, I was traveling with my 6-month-old daughter Emily. When the engines failed, all I could think was that she would never grow up, never have a first day of school, never fall in love. Because of you, she will have all of that. You gave her a lifetime. How do I ever thank you for that?" The next was from an elderly man. "I'm 83 years old and thought I'd lived a full life. But my grandson is getting married next month, and I would have missed it. You gave me that day. You gave me the chance to see my family's joy one more time. God bless you, Colonel." There were 190 letters, each one a testament to a life saved, a future preserved, a family kept whole. Reynolds cleared his throat. "There's something else you should know. First Officer Lisa Chen applied to the Air Force Reserve. She's starting flight training next month. She said that day in the cockpit showed her what real flying looks like, and she wants to serve." Sarah looked up, surprised. "She's an excellent pilot. The Air Force will be lucky to have her. She says she had the best teacher," Reynolds replied with a smile. "Even if it was only for 43 minutes. After Reynolds left, Sarah sat alone with the letters, reading each one late into the night. There was the businessman who made it home for his daughter's high school graduation. The honeymoon couple who would celebrate their 50th anniversary because of that day. The cancer survivor traveling for treatment who got to continue her fight. The college student heading home to reconcile with his father. Each letter represented not just one life, but the ripple effects of that life, the children who would be born, the love that would be shared, the contributions they would make to the world. Sarah had saved 190 people, but the true number was incalculable. 3 months after the incident, Sarah was called to testify before a congressional subcommittee on aviation safety. The hearing room was packed with media, aviation experts, and military personnel. Senator Patricia Morrison, chair of the committee, addressed Sarah with visible respect. "Colonel Mackenzie, your actions on March 15 have raised important questions about commercial aviation training and emergency preparedness. Can you walk us through your decision-making process that day?" Sarah spoke clearly and professionally, explaining the technical aspects of the emergency and the military procedures she had applied. But then she shifted focus. "Senator, with respect, I believe this hearing is focusing on the wrong question. The question isn't, what did I do differently? The question should be, why are we not preparing all commercial pilots for these scenarios?" The room went silent. Sarah continued. "Captain Reynolds and First Officer Chen are exceptional pilots who performed brilliantly under impossible conditions. But they were working with training designed for routine emergencies, not catastrophic cascading failures. Military pilots train for worst-case scenarios because in combat, Murphy's Law is a guarantee, not a possibility." She leaned forward, her voice passionate. "Commercial aviation has an outstanding safety record precisely because these events are rare. But when they do happen, we need pilots equipped with every possible tool. I'm not suggesting commercial pilots need combat training. I'm suggesting that certain advanced emergency procedures that have saved countless military aircraft, should be incorporated into civilian training programs." Senator Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "What would that look like, Colonel?" "Simulator training for multiple simultaneous failures. Manual flight techniques for degraded control systems. Emergency decision-making under extreme stress. Power management for damaged aircraft. These aren't theoretical exercises, they're proven survival techniques that could make the difference between tragedy and triumph." The testimony sparked a national conversation about aviation training. Within 6 months, the FAA announced a new initiative to incorporate advanced emergency procedures into commercial pilot training, directly citing Sarah's recommendations. 1 year after the emergency, American Airlines organized a reunion event for everyone aboard Flight 1847. It was held at a hotel near Louis Armstrong International Airport, the same airport where they had made their emergency landing. Sarah almost didn't attend. She had never been comfortable with attention or praise. But Jessica, the flight attendant, had personally called and convinced her. "Colonel, these people need to see you. They need to thank you. They need closure. Please come." The ballroom was decorated with photos from that day, the damaged aircraft, the emergency response, news coverage, and even screenshots of the viral F-22 flyby video. As Sarah entered, the entire room fell silent. Then, as one, all 190 people stood and began applauding. The ovation lasted 5 minutes. Sarah saw tears streaming down faces, saw parents holding children who wouldn't exist without that day, saw couples embracing, saw joy and gratitude that made her own eyes well with tears. The young mother with 6-month-old Emily approached first. Emily was now walking, a toddler with bright eyes and an infectious smile. "Colonel Mackenzie, this is Emily. I wanted you to meet her properly. Every birthday, every milestone, I'll tell her about the hero who gave her life." One by one, passengers approached with stories, hugs, and thanks. The elderly man introduced his grandson's new wife. The cancer survivor announced she was in remission. The college student said he had reconciled with his father and they now talked every week. Captain Reynolds stood at the podium for a formal address. A year ago, 190 people faced death at 41,000 feet. We're all here today because one woman, sitting quietly in seat 27B, possessed not just the skills but the courage to act when action seemed impossible. Colonel Sarah Reaper Mackenzie represents the very best of military service, the dedication, the excellence, the selflessness that defines true heroism. He paused, his voice breaking slightly. In aviation, we have a saying, any landing you can walk away from is a good landing. Well, 190 people walked away that day. That's not just a good landing. That's a miracle performed by a master. First Officer Lisa Chen, now wearing an Air Force Reserve uniform, stood next. "Colonel Mackenzie, I want you to know that your example changed my life. I'm now training to serve my country, learning from your legacy. You showed me that flying is more than a job, it's a calling. Thank you for answering yours." As the evening concluded, Sarah stood by the windows overlooking the same runway where they had landed a year ago. Captain Reynolds joined her. "Any regrets, Colonel?" he asked. "About stepping forward that day?" Sarah smiled. "My only regret is that I initially hesitated for 30 seconds before standing up. 30 seconds of wondering if I should stay in my seat and mind my own business." "What changed your mind?" "I heard my old squadron commander's voice in my head. He used to say, you don't get to choose when duty calls, Reaper. You only get to choose whether you answer." So I answered. Reynolds nodded. 190 people are grateful you did. Every day, I wake up and think about the fact that I'm alive, my wife still has a husband, my kids still have a father, all because you answered that call. Through the window, Sarah saw the evening lights of aircraft taking off and landing, each one carrying people with hopes and dreams, families and futures. Commercial aviation moved millions of people safely every day, a miracle of human engineering and professional dedication. But sometimes, rarely, when everything went wrong, when conventional procedures weren't enough, when lives hung in the balance, that's when you needed someone who had trained for the impossible. That's when you needed someone like Reaper. As Sarah drove home that night, her phone buzzed with a text from Major Morrison, one of the F-22 pilots who had performed the flyby. "Colonel, thought you'd want to know. That aileron roll we did over New Orleans? It's now taught in advanced fighter training as the Reaper roll. When students ask why, instructors tell them about you. About excellence. About service. About answering the call. Your legacy inspires a new generation. Thank you for showing us what it means to be the best. Sarah pulled over and read the message 3 times, tears streaming down her face. She had spent 30 years building a career, flying missions, training pilots, serving her country. She had thought retirement meant her story was over. But Flight 1847 had shown her something profound: excellence never retires. Service never ends. The call signs we earn don't define just our military careers, they define who we are for life. She was Reaper. Not because of the missions she had flown or the enemies she had defeated. But because when death came for 190 innocent people, she had appeared like a specter from the shadows and said, "Not today." Sarah Mackenzie started her car and headed home, knowing that somewhere above her, pilots were training, learning, preparing for their own moments when duty would call. And when those moments came, they would remember the legend of Reaper, the woman in seat 27B who saved 190 lives and reminded the world that heroes walk among us, unremarkable and unnoticed, until the impossible demands their excellence. The true measure of a pilot isn't found in perfect conditions or routine flights. It's found in those desperate moments when everything goes wrong, when conventional wisdom says failure is inevitable, and when only exceptional skill and courage can make the difference between tragedy and triumph. Colonel Sarah Mackenzie proved that day over New Orleans that excellence never retires. It just waits for its moment to shine. And when that moment comes, legends answer the call. As the evening concluded, Sarah stood by the windows overlooking the same runway where they had landed a year ago. Captain Reynolds joined her. "Any regrets, Colonel?" he asked. "About stepping forward that day?" Sarah smiled. "My only regret is that I initially hesitated for 30 seconds before standing up. 30 seconds of wondering if I should stay in my seat and mind my own business." "What changed your mind?" "I heard my old squadron commander's voice in my head. He used to say, 'You don't get to choose when duty calls, Reaper. You only get to choose whether you answer.' So I answered." Reynolds nodded. 190 people are grateful you did. Every day, I wake up and think about the fact that I'm alive, my wife still has a husband, my kids still have a father, all because you answered that call." Through the window, Sarah saw the evening lights of aircraft taking off and landing, each one carrying people with hopes and dreams, families and futures. Commercial aviation moved millions of people safely every day, a miracle of human engineering and professional dedication. But sometimes, rarely, when everything went wrong, when conventional procedures weren't enough, when lives hung in the balance, that's when you needed someone who had trained for the impossible. That's when you needed someone like Reaper. As Sarah drove home that night, her phone buzzed with a text from Major Morrison, one of the F-22 pilots who had performed the flyby. "Colonel, thought you'd want to know. That aileron roll we did over New Orleans? It's now taught in advanced fighter training as the Reaper roll. When students ask why, instructors tell them about you. About excellence. About service. About answering the call. Your legacy inspires a new generation. Thank you for showing us what it means to be the best." Sarah pulled over and read the message 3 times, tears streaming down her face. She had spent 30 years building a career, flying missions, training pilots, serving her country. She had thought retirement meant her story was over. But Flight 1847 had shown her something profound: excellence never retires. Service never ends. The call signs we earn don't define just our military careers, they define who we are for life. She was Reaper. Not because of the missions she had flown or the enemies she had defeated. But because when death came for 190 innocent people, she had appeared like a specter from the shadows and said, "Not today." Sarah Mackenzie started her car and headed home, knowing that somewhere above her, pilots were training, learning, preparing for their own moments when duty would call. And when those moments came, they would remember the legend of Reaper, the woman in seat 27B who saved 190 lives and reminded the world that heroes walk among us, unremarkable and unnoticed, until the impossible demands their excellence. The true measure of a pilot isn't found in perfect conditions or routine flights. It's found in those desperate moments when everything goes wrong, when conventional wisdom says failure is inevitable, and when only exceptional skill and courage can make the difference between tragedy and triumph. Colonel Sarah Mackenzie proved that day over New Orleans that excellence never retires. It just waits for its moment to shine. And when that moment comes, legends answer the call.